without further ado, I call to the podium Dr. Mark Domenick.
I want to thank you all for inviting me here. When Pastor Mike called, he said, would you mind giving this speech, kind of this message? And I said, do I have to wear a tie? He said, no. I said, I'll be there. I want to thank my wife for coming. Teresa always helps me out. And hopefully we got the slides figured out. If not, we'll still make this work. One of the things I did want to say, I know you had your prayer time for praise and requests. I can tell you from being in the medical profession now for 30 years, prayer makes a difference. So really, it's not just something we should take lightly. It truly makes a difference in how patients' outcomes come about. The old saying is, God does the healing, we do the billing. Anyway, let's start off and see if we can get the first slide to come up here. We do serve a big God, and hopefully the next little video will kind of show, I want to put things in perspective, how large a God we serve. Let's see if we can get this thing rolling. You might say, well, what's this have to do with the death of Jesus Christ? We'll get there, but I just, as I studied for the lecture about the death of Jesus Christ, I just started to think about God in general, how awesome, how amazing God we serve. And you think about the universe, and he created it all just by saying the words. So this kind of gives us a perspective of where we are in the universe. As you can see there, the Earth's circumference is 24,000 miles. That's at the equator. So if you were sitting at the equator right now, sitting in church, this is somewhat, I always ponder on this, you would actually be moving at 1,000 miles per hour, sitting in your seat, because 24 hours, and Earth does one cycle. It says there that 1 million Earths will fit inside the sun. So just to kind of give you a perspective, if the Earth was a golf ball, and being a good doctor, I just happen to have a golf ball, you would be able to fill up basically half of the church with golf balls to equal the size of the sun. So our little Earth, our sun, would be half the church. It just gives you a perspective. And then you think of the size of us on the Earth. And then you can see here the other stars, how big they are. The one that I like, the very last one there, I think it's almost mind-boggling to think of these numbers. Canis Majoris, that's, I think, Latin for big dog. 7 quadrillion Earths would fit inside that star. So if the Earth was a golf ball, you would be able to fill up the state of Texas 2 feet deep with golf balls to equal the size of that star. And we're not even sure that's the biggest star. It's just the biggest star that we know of. We serve a pretty awesomely large God. Kind of put this in perspective also, because sometimes when we talk about numbers, billions, trillions, and then quadrillions, like what is that number? Well, this sort of gives you an idea. 1 million seconds is 12 days ago. 1 billion seconds, actually this slide needs to be updated, would be 1987. That's 1 billion seconds. 1 trillion seconds would be 30,000 BC, which I can tell you, I believe in the entire Word of God. I believe the Bible says that the earth is not that old, okay? But this just is to put things in a time perspective. And 1 quadrillion seconds, remember, 7 quadrillion Earths could fit inside that star, is 31 million BC. We're talking that large enough. Those numbers are mind-boggling. All right, let's go ahead and move to the next one. See here. So God is God of the very large. He's also God of the very small. The very small includes atoms that create amino acids. Amino acids create proteins. Proteins bind together in a molecule called DNA. And DNA is the blueprint, the backbone of what makes you and I. So DNA makes me 5'4". I was hoping God would be a little more generous when he thought about me and knitting me together, but you know, he said 5'4" is as far as you go. I'm okay with that. I do miss the 1970s though, when we used to have the platform shoes. That was when I could be 5'6". Even the Word of God tells us that he knew what we were going to be even before we were created. In Psalms 139, he does say, For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful, and I know that full well. Now, hopefully this next video will show, I want to kind of explain it as it plays. Oh, didn't come up. And it's okay. If we can't get it, we can just go on to here. So DNA, everybody's heard of DNA. It's what kind of makes us who we are. And this is a computer animation, but we think it's pretty real to life how DNA is replicated inside the cell. So you have RNA that goes into the helix, and you have polymerases and some other protein molecules that allow RNA to be replicated into DNA molecules, which then go and form other proteins, which is what eventually forms all the organs in your body. And this is actually probably a pretty good representation of what actually happens at the cellular level. And I think that looks a little bit like knitting. So when God in his word said he knit us together in our mother's womb, he was giving a really good scientific description of what was occurring at the molecular cellular level. The Bible's not just a book of spiritual truth. It's actually a pretty scientific book, which makes sense. I mean, God invented science, so you know, when you dig deep into the Word, you can actually see some of these other prospects coming out. Okay, now we can keep going. Again, this is just some background before I get to the actual physical death. I just think it hopefully opens up your mind and helps you understand the complexity of who we are. And even as a physician, as a doctor, every time I look at this and restudy this, it just amazes me of what a great creation we are. We all have had cuts. We've all had bruises. When you cut yourself, the blood that flows out of the cut eventually has to stop, or else you'd bleed to death, you know. This is a representation of what goes on in your body when you cut yourself. And the reason I like to point this out is because this is a very complex cascade, and yet it works in all of us. And in fact, if any of you know people who are on blood thinners like Coumadin and things like that because of medical aspects, they work at different levels of this cascade to try to thin the blood. The point of this is that this is something that couldn't have just evolved, in my opinion. And I think if you're a true investigate it scientifically, you would say the same thing, because each one of these steps, these 12 steps, has to occur in order for your blood to stop bleeding when you cut yourself. All the steps had to be present from the very beginning. So if you only had steps 1 through 4, which is what the evolutionists will tell you, then when you cut yourself, you would probably bleed to death. So how could you even evolve into the other steps? The point I'm trying to make is I think our anatomy, our physiology points to God's creation. We are created beings, and I think science actually helps back that up. You miss out on any one of these steps, you don't survive because you bleed to death. And here's the other neat thing, is each step, as you see the cascade coming down, the next product that's developed does what we call a feedback loop. It goes back to help inhibit the overproduction of the step before it. Because if you start producing too much of those factors, then you'll overclot, and then you turn into one big blood clot. So the system is such that it's perfect. We make just enough to stop the bleeding, and when the bleeding stops, the body recognizes that, and it stops producing those factors so that we don't continue to clot. Okay, let's go to the next one. Just going to run this real quick. I want you to think of our anatomy, and just something as simple as the ear. How do we hear? So think about it. You're hearing me right now. That's going on. And what's amazing, when we did anatomy in medical school and actually had to do some dissection, we dissected the inner ear. These bones are really, really tiny. In fact, that stirrup, that final bone that actually vibrates the cochlear mechanism, which is what sends the little fluid waves into the inner ear, which makes those little hair cells move back, which then changes mechanical energy into electrochemical energy, which then gets transmitted to your brain, and your brain says, I'm hearing Dr. Domenick say words right now. All that has to work, and that tiny bone is the smallest bone of the body. It has to be perfectly formed, and because if you hear a sound too quickly, too loudly, too suddenly, if that bone was to vibrate too vigorous, it would rupture that small cochlear membrane, which would then make you go deaf. So the tiniest bone is held by the tiniest muscle in the body that is programmed through the nervous system to contract if the sound's too loud, so that that bone doesn't over vibrate that system, so that you won't become permanently deaf. Could that happen just by chance? I say probably not. In fact, the scientific mathematicians have calculated the probability of human beings evolving from a set of just primordial soup to be approximately 1 to 10 to the 260th power. It's just almost impossible. In fact, it is impossible. That tells me God created us. Anyway, we keep on going to the next slide, please. I'm saying all that to kind of give you, again, this background. In my opinion, God created us. He created us in His image. He created us to worship Him. He wanted us to be in fellowship with Him. God gave human beings certain characteristics that I don't think He put in the animal world. So, for example, here, He created us in His likeness, okay? The attributes that we have as humans that I think are kind of specific is, you know, we have the ability to cry if we're sad. We can feel guilt. I mean, think about this. You guys, a lot of you, I'm sure, are dog owners. If you have two dogs and you put the food out and one of the dogs is, in a different room and your other dog gets to both bowls of food, he doesn't go back to his doggy friend and say, "Oh, man, I'm sorry I ate your food. I feel pretty bad about that. Next time you can have my food." No, you know what the dog's thinking? The dog's thinking what's mine is mine and what's yours is mine if I get there first. Humans are different in that we still might do the wrong thing, but we do have a conscience. That's the Holy Spirit talking in us, saying, you know what? This is not how God created us to be. He gave us the ability to forgive. He gave us the ability to choose from right and wrong. And then the most precious gift, and this will get to the lecture now, is He gave us the gift of free will. So God loved us so much, He gave us the free will to choose not to love Him back. It is our choice. He could have made us all just as kind of machines to just love Him and worship Him, but He gave us the free will not to do that. And it's that free will that was violated by Adam and Eve that brought sin into the world. God loved us so much that He said, hey, the people I created to worship Me and praise Me chose to have the free will, and sin entered the world, so I'm going to love them enough to give them a way to get out of that sin and be reconciled to Me. And that's what we're going to talk about now, is the physical death, what Jesus had to go through to reconcile our sins. So this original article was clear back in the Journal of American Medicine back in 1986, and that's a long time ago, but still I think it's pretty pertinent. I've done other readings and I've done a little research, and I haven't seen anything much better than this original article that explains the physical death of Jesus Christ. So we'll keep on going. just to give you a little bit of background, obviously we don't have a body to examine. Jesus is alive and well sitting at the right hand of the Father, but we do have history that tells us what happened. In fact, we have a lot of documented history that says these are the events that occurred during resurrection, or I should say from Palm Sunday up to his death on Good Friday and then the resurrection on Sunday, the following Sunday. These are reliable sources of history that tell us what went on. And in fact, I think this again just tells me how amazing God we serve. He allowed different sources to occur that pretty much covers all areas of society. Obviously, as Christians, we believe in the Bible, we believe in its truth, and the four Gospels are quite detailed in what happened during that week. But for people who aren't Christians, they're going to say, hey, the Bible, we don't believe that's a book of truth. It's just a bunch of people that wrote words and there's no truth to it. Well, as far as other sources, as you can see there, Roman historians also wrote about Jesus' life and his crucifixion and his death. You can see there Cornelius and Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, Suetonius. Those were Roman historians. So they documented Jesus' life and death on the earth. And then you had people who were just seculars in the secular society, really weren't part of the Roman society, that also wrote about it. And even the Jews, the Jewish society back in that day, had historian Josephus, who wrote about Jesus' life and death. So we have many, many good sources that says Jesus was real, he lived on this earth, he was crucified, and he died. Let's go to the next one, please. So just again, a little bit of background. I know I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, but the history was Jesus was about 30 years old when he started his ministry, and his ministry lasted about 3 years on this earth. Okay? He was a carpenter. Just as in today, carpenter work is very physical labor. It takes a lot of physical strength to be a carpenter, probably even more so back in that day than it does now. Also, during his time here on the earth, he walked. There was no transportation system. He didn't have a nice vehicle. They walked pretty much the entire length and breadth of the nation of Israel, which was thousands of miles. And even the week, this Passover week that we're celebrating now, even that week he went in and found people exchanging monies in the temple, turned over these money tables, which were not little card tables. These were big, heavy, probably oak tables weighing hundreds of pounds. And the point here is that God required an unblemished, perfect lamb as a sacrifice for the forgiveness of sins. And the historical evidence points to that Jesus was in just perfect physical shape. He wasn't someone who was sickly. He was a perfect lamb that went to the cross. You know, I was just thinking here as I was saying that, talking about being in shape. You know, I think if we did that Father Abraham song 30 minutes every day, everybody's cholesterol would be normal, our blood pressures would be fine. So we should maybe start promoting that as a medical treatment, huh? All right, let's go to the next one. So we know Passover occurred on Thursday night. Jesus broke bread and drank the wine with his disciples. That was the last bit of nourishment he had prior to going to the cross. Then he went to the Garden of Gethsemane to pray. And this shows the humanness of Jesus. This is something that still just, it's hard for me sometimes to comprehend. Jesus was all God. He was divine, but he was all human, meaning he felt everything we felt, but knew everything God knew. And I think later on I'll talk about this a little bit, but think about going to the cross, knowing everything physiologically, anatomically, biologically that was going to happen to you, but being human, knowing that you were going to feel all that. That would cause a large amount of stress on the body, mentally first and then physically second. We read in Luke that, and being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat fell like drops of blood falling to the ground. emotional states, strong emotional states, actually can be associated with bloody sweat. We call that hemohydrosis. What happens is the small capillary vessels, the very tiny microscopic blood vessels that surround the sweat glands, basically kind of break down so that blood then enters into the gland and comes out in your sweat. So when it says fell like drops of blood, he truly was bleeding, sweating blood, which can make the skin very fragile and can cause some dehydration. Jesus was arrested by the Sanhedrin. He was tried, illegal trial by the way, and was found guilty of blasphemy. We can go to the next slide. Blasphemy was punishable by death according to the Jews, but as you can see here, the Jews could not sentence anyone to death. It had to be a death sentence by the Romans. And the Romans didn't recognize blasphemy as a crime. So the Sanhedrin said, we need to come to the Roman government with something more than this in order to achieve what we want to achieve, which is to have Jesus killed. They declared Jesus as a traitor, someone who was trying to overthrow the Roman government. And that was a punishable death, or a punishable crime by death. But Pontius Pilate, I mean, he was the governor at the time, but obviously he could recognize that what was going on was not, this was kind of a drummed up charge. But they were persistent. In Luke we read, with their loud shouts, they intensified their demand that he be crucified, and their shouts prevailed. So Pilate, being a person who considered his position more important than the truth, gave in to their demands, and he actually allowed Jesus then to be sentenced for crucifixion and death. Let's go to the next one then. When a person in that day was sentenced to be crucified, the Roman law required that they be scourged. And scourging was basically whipping. But it's not the type of whipping that maybe we even think about. Some of us are old enough to know about getting a whipping. But even at that point, yeah, it stung a little bit, but your parents never whipped you hard. This type of scourging was so severe that in some cases it could even cause death. But the Roman soldiers were very good about knowing when to stop and how hard to do the scourging so that death did not occur. When the victim was scourged, they were often stripped, they were tied to a pole, often they were naked, very humiliating because it was a public display. This was not done privately in a back room. This was done in an open area where everyone could see it. Also, at that point, the person was forced to carry their own cross to the area of execution. And, of course, once they were crucified, it was determined that they had to be dead on the cross before they could be taken down. And, in fact, with crucifixion back in the Roman days, a lot of times, unless you had a family member or someone who cared about you, the body was simply left on the cross to completely deteriorate. It would just decompose up on the cross. It was the Romans saying, do not do what this person did, or this will be the fate that you might endure. I mean, it was gruesome. Birds would pick at the flesh. There'd be insects that would crawl in, deteriorate, worms. I mean, it was just a terrible method of death. Let's go to the next slide. The Romans didn't invent crucifixion. The Persians probably invented crucifixions, but the Romans perfected crucifixion. They figured out how we can nail a person to a cross to cause the maximum amount of pain for the maximum amount of time. I mean, they truly did just have, they wanted to make a statement that said, this is the punishment that occurs for the crime that you committed. And we know, even from the Gospels, that the person's crime, what they were convicted of, was placed on the top of the cross. Okay, in Jesus' case, it said King of the Jews. That was his crime. It was reserved only for the vilest of criminals. Women could not be crucified. Roman citizens could not be crucified. The only Roman citizen that could suffer crucifixion would be a Roman soldier that deserted the army, because it was known to be that vile. The Romans wanted crucifixion to say, don't do this crime or this will be your fate. The Jews the Jews that convicted Jesus, they wanted him crucified because their own law in Deuteronomy, we can read there in Deuteronomy, it says, you must not leave the body hanging on the pole overnight. Be sure to bury it the same day, because anyone who's hung on a pole is under God's curse. So what the Jews, the Sanhedrin, wanted to say is, look, this Jesus who claimed to be your Messiah, and who you were temporarily also saying this is the Messiah who's come to earth, if he's hanging on the cross, how could God have sent him? Because God's own word's saying he's cursed. They didn't understand God's plan of redemption. Jesus had to be a curse for sin and for the forgiveness of sin. Okay, let's go to the next one, please. So let's talk about now what happens medically. With what we know, with our medical knowledge today and the history given from the Gospels, this is a deduction of what we think actually Jesus went through. Again, remember he in the garden suffered the bloody sweat, the hemohydrosis, that would cause him to be dehydrated, that would make his skin very friable, very tender, and set him up for when the scourging occurred to cause severe injury. Next slide says that in Psalms 129 and 3, the plowmen have plowed my back and made their furrows long. Now this next video from the Passion, it's a little bit gruesome. If there's some little ones that might be a little scared, you might want to just turn their eyes a little. But I think it really shows, hopefully we can get it, that shows how severe scourging was in those days.
Gusta! Gusta!
So these wasn't just little taps on the back. I mean, these scourger whips that the Romans had were long leather straps filled with they were tied small iron balls. There was pieces of bone. There was pieces of rock embedded in these whips. And the Romans would use them to go around the skin, and you could see how they would entrap, get deep into the skin. So when the psalmist said, plowed my back with furrows, they literally looked like furrows. So this would quickly just tear the skin, tear the fatty tissue under the skin, and usually within 2 or 3 whippings would go into the muscle tissue. And when it went into the muscle tissue, then it would start causing the severe pain and bleeding that could sometimes even result in death. This is just kind of an illustration of how they were tied to the pole. And let's go ahead to the next slide too. So what scourging would cause is that, first of all, it would be severely painful. I mean, it's probably pain that we can't even truly describe, because it would go into the muscles where the nerve fibers were found, and those nerve fibers, every time the whip would hit, would be stimulated. Scourging would cause a large amount of bleeding. I mean, enough bleeding that a person would start to develop the early stages of what we call in medicine hypovolemic shock. So I don't want to get too technical. There are a few nurses I know here in the congregation, and they can give you maybe more technical description later on. But hypovolemic shock occurs when you start bleeding and you are not replacing the volume, the blood that you lose, either with fluids or blood. So what's happening is your body is trying to function with less blood than what it should have. And when the body recognizes it has less blood, it starts other organs working in a way to compensate for that. So you start breathing faster, your heart starts beating faster, your kidneys start to shut down a little bit, your other organs just don't start to function, your muscles, your nerves, and your brain. They all start to alter and shut down, trying to compensate for this loss of blood. And this loss of blood could be a fair amount. I mean, we're talking 3, 4, 5 pints. After Jesus was scourged, then he was mocked. He had a crown of thorns placed onto his head. These were not little tiny thorns. These thorns back in those days were probably 2.5 inches with points on them that was pushed down into his scalp. We've all been pricked by a thorn bush. This would be like a thorn bush sitting on your head with pressure on it. And it would be very painful, also very disgraceful. I mean, think of the mental anguish he would be going through because this was all a public spectacle. Everybody could see this. Let's go ahead and go next. This is just an illustration of Jesus carrying the cross. There was two types of crosses. There's the traditional T cross, which was used some back in the Roman days. The more common cross was called the tall cross. That's where the upright post was already in the ground at the site of crucifixion, and the condemned, the victim, was just carried the crossbar. And more likely, even though we like to predict or show this as the type of cross in movies and our illustrations, more likely it was the tall cross that Jesus carried. And I think this is important because we know Jesus, that crossbar would weigh 50 to 75 pounds. Jesus was, like I said, a fully healthy adult man. He fell 3 times walking to Golgotha, carrying 50 pounds on his shoulders. That tells us how severely he was scourged, how much blood he probably lost. He was severely injured just through the scourging, even before he got up to the site of crucifixion. Let's go to the next. So the site of crucifixion was Golgotha. It was outside of the city. Believe it or not, this area most likely was kind of the garbage dump of Jerusalem. The Romans wanted crucifixion to be in a very noticeable site. It was actually up on a hill, but they also wanted it in a site that everybody detested. So this was the area where the farmers would bring their waste, the animals' dung, their garbage. It would be probably even a place to expose human waste. It was just a dirty, ugly place. And again, that was purposeful so that the Romans would say, if you do this crime, this is what's going to happen to you in this place. When the victim, the condemned, carried his cross up to the site, and they got to the site, they actually usually were wrapped in a robe in order to walk up to the site. But then when they got there, the robe was ripped off of them. We know that from the Gospels. We know Jesus' robe was not cut. It was kept as a full garment. But think about this. We've all had cuts. We've put Band-Aids on a cut, and the blood dries underneath the Band-Aid. And then what happens if you rip the Band-Aid off too quickly, right? You reopen the cut, you start to bleed again. So when Jesus got to the site, any dried blood that might have dried to his garment, and the Roman soldiers ripped that off, all that would be opened up again and start bleeding again. Then the victim wasn't gently set down to the ground and nailed to the cross. I mean, everything the Romans did was to be painful and humiliating. They would throw the victim down. So Jesus has these big furrows of open flesh from the scourging, ripped open by the removing of his garment, thrown down on the ground, which is a garbage dump full of bacteria, human waste, animal waste, before he was even nailed to the cross. And think about this. I mean, I can tell you this from my own medical practice. The bacteria that's in the ground can cause infection within 30 minutes to an hour. I've actually seen this in the Amish community. And so you have these big open wounds being thrown down into the garbage dump, just full of bacteria now. That's one more thing that could occur during the crucifixion. Not just the pain from the crucifixion, but infection starting. Let's go ahead to the next slide there. This is the part I think maybe the Romans didn't know they were doing this, but this actually shows how they perfected crucifixion. The nail used in Roman times was as shown in the slide up here. The head was fairly flat, it's kind of square, and then it tapered down to a point. So it's not like the nails we have today where it's more of a point and then symmetrical all the way up to the head. The reason this is important, or I think significant, is because this type of nail, once it pierced the skin and was pounded through, would not just poke through the skin until it hit the wood, but it would poke through and then it would stretch because of the way the nail was formed. There is nothing more painful to the human body than stretching. And I'm going to give you an example. For all you ladies who've had kids, when you're in labor, you are stretching. And I think you all know how painful your labor was. Most of the time it is. I won't say forever. Not everybody, but. And for those women that said, oh, my labor was easy, I know other women want to go up and just slap them. Because I don't think, if you really are honest, labor's easy. But that's a stretching of the birth canal. So women can understand that. For all men or women who have ever had a kidney stone, if you've passed a kidney stone, that stone is stretching the ureter as it's passing down to the bladder. And I've seen grown men, 6'3", 210 pounds, down on their knees trying to pass a kidney stone. It is such a severe pain. So it's stretching is one of the hardest, worst pains the human body can endure or feel. So just placing that nail into his hands and into his feet, the puncture alone would hurt. Then you got that stretching of the muscle and the ligament tissue. And then on top of that, as they pounded it in, it would pound and entrap. It actually, your median nerve, that's the nerve that controls these fingers and the grip of your hand, it would be crushed. When you crush a nerve, that's very painful too. Think of anybody's really hit their elbow hard on a corner and you get that, you say that funny bone. That's not a bone, that's your ulnar nerve. And you sit there and you shake and you try to get that out of your hand, and it's that dull, nauseating pain. That's what he experienced when the nail went through his hand. We can go to the next slide too. You know, it says Jesus was nailed to the cross. The Romans would nail crucifixion victims to the cross. Sometimes they would tie them. Sometimes they would do both. A lot of times we depict the nail as going through the palm of the hand, like right here. And that could be what happened to Jesus. If that happened, he would also have to be tied to the cross, because a nail in the palm affixed to the cross could not hold the weight of the human body. With you nailed to a cross, if the nail was here, that nail would just pull right up through the flesh. There's nothing there strong enough to hold the weight of the human body. Now, I think more likely is the nail went into the wrist, which was considered part of the hand in Romans' days, and it went through the carpal ligament. Anybody's ever had carpal tunnel surgery? That's the ligament that they cut to release the pressure on the nerve. That ligament is like a leather belt. And that alone, you could put a nail through the carpal ligament, nail your body to the cross, and it would hold the weight. And that's more likely, I think, where the nail was placed in Jesus' hand, which again would crush that nerve. It would bruise but not break the bone. Bruising of the bone is also extremely painful. I like to give examples because I think that's what kind of tells us, well, okay, this maybe is what he felt. Anybody ever walked up a set of steps and you kind of slip and you hit your shin on the edge of the step, and that, you know, that shin, you got to rub it and you try to get the pain out, and it's just that dull, nauseating pain. It just makes you feel like sometimes you want to throw up. That's what a bone bruise is, a periosteal bruise, and that's what these nails would do in both the hands and the feet. Except when you hit your shin on the step, it's temporary because you're not there continuing to run into the step. This would be continuous. Let's go on to the next slide. And again, this just shows the feet. The feet could be overlapped so that the nail would insert in a place where no bones would be broken. Keep going. And now I want to get to this part where I think the most likely cause of what happens with crucifixion to the body occurs. And this was with the actual position on the cross. I'm going to just step out here. So remember, Jesus is nailed to the cross, got nails in his wrist, both sides, pushing down on the nerve, bruising the bone, caused a little bit of bleeding, but not much. But he's got all that bleeding from his back because he was scourging. He's got nails in his feet. So he's on the cross like this, just fixed there, with your arms fixed up like this and your feet not moving. These muscles of your ribs, your chest wall, can't function well. So I think when you're all just sitting there breathing, you're not thinking much of it. Breathing is a parasympathetic type of process in the body. It's one of those things the brain just does and we don't feel. The negative pressure, air runs in through the nose and the mouth down into the lungs. Air gets exchanged through the lungs into the bloodstream, the oxygen. Carbon dioxide from the bloodstream goes back into the lung tissue, and then when you breathe out, the carbon dioxide gets released. Breathing out doesn't require any effort. When you think about it, it just happens. It's like stretching a balloon, and then the balloon relaxes. That's how we breathe in and out every day. When you are transfixed to a cross, those muscles no longer can stretch the lung cavity. So your breathing in and out mainly occurs by use of the diaphragm, this muscle that separates your chest from your abdominal cavity, and a little bit of elasticity of the lungs still being able to collapse some. The trouble, you can go ahead to the next slide too. The trouble with this type of breathing is it's not very effective. And again, we went through medical school and learned physiology and learned anatomy. What we found is that the brain is oxygen dependent. So when your oxygen level goes down, the brain wants more, and it does that by increasing how rapidly you breathe. Or also, when the carbon dioxide level builds up in your body because you're not getting gas out, the brain senses that and it wants you to breathe deeper. So when Jesus is up on the cross and he can't breathe deep, oxygen's not getting in, carbon dioxide's not getting out, his brain's saying, I need more oxygen, I need you to get rid of carbon dioxide, you need to take a deep breath. The only way to take a deep breath for a crucified victim would be to push himself up, lift himself up, so that these muscles aren't stretched and fixed, so that he can breathe in deep and then exhale. So every time Jesus needed to take a deep breath and he pulled himself up, his hands would rotate along those nails that had crushed the nerve, and his feet would push on the nail that had bruised the bones. So he would pick himself up to try to breathe normally. Of course, the pain at that point would be severe, extremely severe. And also think about this, his back is open with all these wounds, and the cross, even this cross is too smooth. I mean, this is kind of rough, but those crosses are like telephone poles. I mean, they had splinters, so every time he'd have to pick himself up, his back would rub up against that cross, and the pain would be just so severe trying to hold himself up that he would just have to drop back down again. And then the cycle of breathing shallow would start again. The oxygen level would go down, the carbon dioxide would build up, his brain would say, I need more. Remember, he's all human. He's God, but he's all human. He's going through everything a human being would go through. He'd have to pick himself up again to try to breathe, and this cycle would just go over and over and over, and to a point where the body would just become exhausted, and to a point where basically what we think occurs is what we call exhaustive asphyxia. You pretty much just suffocate because you can't keep the normal breathing process going. And if you think about being on the cross for the hours that he was there suffering that, it just humbles you. It humbles me. Let's go to the next slide. So what actually happened at the cross when Jesus died? We know all the preliminaries. We know the scourging. We know the breathing problem while he's on the cross. So what actually happens? Because we know the scriptures tell us that, in Luke, now I'm actually one slide ahead, but we'll get there. Jesus called out with a loud voice, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. When he said this, he breathed his last. Well, actually, let's go to that, if you would. The next slide, please. What the scriptures imply there is that Jesus was suffering all this stuff I just mentioned, but at that point, something happened. At that point, he died. So he was suffering, and then he died. It says he said his last, bowed his head, gave up the spirit. So what maybe happened medically to the body right at that point? Well, one of the things, even in a young, healthy person, that could happen when you're under that much stress is a heart attack, a myocardial infarction. When the body is under that much stress, not getting oxygen, not exchanging carbon dioxide, you're anemic, your blood count is low because you've lost all that blood with the scourging, you can develop what we call thrombus formation in the coronary arteries. They're little clots of fibrin and protein that just build up. So instead of having a nice clean artery, you're getting this debris that's building up in there. And then it eventually just fills up the artery completely, and that's what a heart attack is. If you've had any friends who've had a heart attack, that's what happens. They build up cholesterol in their artery, and the cholesterol eventually fills up the artery, and blood can't get through, and so there's no blood, there's no oxygen. That causes a heart attack. So that could have occurred with Jesus. Again, even though he was young and healthy prior. The other thing is he could have had a papillary muscle rupture. I think this is a good possibility. I'm going to teach you a little bit of anatomy. Inside the heart, if you were to cut the heart open, on the left side, which is your pumping mechanism, that's the strong side of the heart, the left side. That's what pumps blood out to the body. The heart valve between the left lower chamber of the heart and the upper chamber is held together by this special muscle called the papillary muscle. Because otherwise, when that heart beats, if it didn't have that extra support, blood would flow backwards as well as forward. That muscle is very important. The blood supply to that muscle goes through the coronary arteries and into the small arteries of the heart. If the blood flow to that muscle is not sufficient, that muscle starts to weaken and actually starts to die, which means that the top part of that muscle can rupture, which means that the valve that it's trying to open and close appropriately all of a sudden just flies open. There's nothing to hold it back. So blood just flushes back and forth. It doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't go to the brain. It doesn't go to the lungs. It basically just flushes back and forth. And that causes death. I've actually seen this one time in my clinical practice. And those people, they die. There's just really nothing you can do. There's no way to get in there and repair that valve quick enough to allow somebody to survive. And I think that's a good possibility of what happened. He could have developed a blood clot in his legs. Remember, his legs are fixed to the cross. They're not moving much. All you who have traveled, you know how they tell you to rotate your calves and move your legs up and down so you don't get a blood clot. Well, Jesus could have pulled blood down there and developed a clot, which could have broken off, moved up his bloodstream, lodged into his lung, and completely shut down his lung, which will shut down the heart and cause death. So that's a possibility too. Or it could be the heart just started beating irregular because of all the stress that was under, and in which case an irregular heartbeat will not allow your heart to perfuse blood to the rest of the body. Any of these are a possibility. Let's go to the next one. When we're done here, I want to give our computer guy a big kudos because he's running back and forth. He's doing a wonderful job. It was Roman law that anyone crucified had to be confirmed that death did occur. The Roman soldier in charge of that had to confirm it. And he could either do it by killing the patient, or not the patient, excuse me, the victim who's back in the office, aren't it? He could do it that way, or, you know, if the body was lowered down, they could confirm death that way too. But the Roman soldier that was in charge of that victim, that crucified victim, was under the penalty of death himself if that victim was did not die on the cross. So the way most of them did is they would thrust a spear or a sword into the victim's side. And we know that occurred. We know that occurred from the Gospels. In John 19:34, it says, instead, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing the sudden flow of blood and water. So that maneuver of putting the spear up into Jesus' side would have killed him. Now, we also know from the Scripture Jesus had died prior to that. And I think that's important because Jesus' life was not taken from him. Jesus gave his life for us. He gave up his life so that we could live. And when it says that blood and water flowed, what happened over that period of time with him being under so much stress on the cross, fluid started to accumulate around the lung. That fluid looks like water. It's a protein fluid. It's very common. Sometimes patients with cancer and stuff will develop fluid around their lung. and they have to go in and get it drained off. When John says blood and water flowed, it didn't mean what they saw first, it just means what they saw. So when the sword went up through here into the heart, it first went through that sac around the lung where the fluid accumulated. That's probably what the water that you mentioned. And then into the heart itself, which would still be full of at least some blood. And that's what flew out. So we know that Jesus definitely died on the cross. You can go to that final, or the next slide. So just to kind of summarize, Jesus was dead prior to the piercing. He gave his life willingly. The Jews did not want his body left on the cross, partly because of Deuteronomy, what we read. So Jesus was actually lowered from the cross, put in the tomb. For the other two victims, the other two condemned that were with Jesus, we don't know too much about them, other than one did confess and give his life to Christ right there on the cross. The other said, well, why don't you save us yourself and me? Crucifixion was often used by the Roman soldiers to hasten death. If a person was on the cross too long and it didn't look like they were suffering enough, they would actually go up and break the lower legs of the victim. And if you think about that, the reason that would cause death so quickly, when you're on the cross trying to breathe, you had to push yourself up in order to breathe. If your legs are broken, the only way you could get yourself up would be to pull yourself up with your hands, which would not last very long because of how much physical strength that takes and the amount of pain. So if they were broken, the legs were broken, you would die very quickly. Jesus was already dead. His legs were not broken. The Bible tells us no bones were broken. I think, hopefully, when I do this lecture, Teresa can tell you, I just try to point out the amount of suffering that occurred, the pain. I think sometimes we read the story, but because nothing like this happened in our day and time, we really don't understand the sacrifice Jesus gave us. I mean, this was the most severe form of death they've ever. And all the medical evidence, I mean, everything as a doctor, if you were to review this, if the Bible was your medical chart and you looked at the evidence, you'd say, this person died on the chart. Because, you know, there's theories still out there, he just fainted, he never did die. And there is no indication that from a medical standpoint that he fainted. He died on the cross. And that happened on Good Friday, which is 5 days from now. But as Christians, and where our hope is what happened on 3 days later on Sunday, and the resurrection. Because it's that belief in that we know it's a fact. And believing in that, and knowing that the Lord went down, destroyed death and hell, and now sits at the right hand, allows us to go to heaven when we die. With a simple act of just belief. We don't have to be crucified. We don't have to suffer. I mean, we all go through trials and suffering here on this earth, but again, that's to be counted all joy. But I really try to emphasize, hopefully, that we understand this is not just a story about someone being killed on the cross. This was a man who was God, who suffered everything a man would suffer to the extreme because he loved us that much. I'm going to turn it back to the pastor, and any questions afterwards, I'll be happy to answer. Thank you all very much.